Recently, I made a beer and needed to use my old kettle and burner, and I missed it. It reminded me of a simpler time in my home brewing journey. There were no pumps, no fancy gadgets. I had a kettle and a brew bag. And you know what? It made beer. Pretty good beer. So today, I'm getting back to the basics, dusting off my kettle and burner and making beer the way I used to. And along the way, I'm gonna let you know where I'd focus on as a new brewer to make the best beer possible. Good beer starts here with good water. After all, beer is mostly water, so it makes sense to start with good stuff. I have always used bottled water for my brewing because I don't trust my tap water. As a beginner, I always thought water salts were really complicated and I was afraid to get into it, but I couldn't have been farther from the truth. Really all you need is a good scale like this one, which is like 20 bucks on Amazon, a few salts, and if you're using an app like Brewfather, it calculates everything for you. But if you're not quite ready for adding your own salts yet, you can totally just go to the store and get reverse osmosis water, or I would even recommend just a good spring water. You don't need to add any salts to that. It already has some minerals in there, and just use that. Now, if you're lucky enough to have good tasting tap water, you can also use that, although I do recommend putting a Camden tablet in there just to make sure there's no chlorine in there, because chlorine will ruin your beer and it will give you an awful taste. So the next thing I'd focus on really kind of goes along with the first thing, and that's just focusing on quality ingredients. Just making sure that you're using good ingredients and that they're stored properly. And for things like water, it really doesn't require any extra effort to store them properly. Things like hops and grains need a little bit more care, but it's really not that hard. And this honestly doesn't take much more time, effort, or money to do properly. So as you can see, my mash is in over there, and I've got my trusty burner, kettle, and my brew bag. I used to cover my kettle with an old sleeping bag to kind of help keep it insulated and maintain temperature better throughout the mash. That sleeping bag was super dirty and crusty, and I threw it away a long time ago. Now, there's a lot of mash experiments that have shown that really mash temperature doesn't impact the final flavor of the beer too much. So as long as you're holding it between, I would say somewhere like 146 and 155, you're gonna make beer. And today, since I was throwing it back to the old days with my old kettle and burner, I thought I'd throw it back to the old days with the beer style that I was brewing as well. It's a historical beer style called a Kentucky Common. Kentucky Common has actually been on my radar for quite some time. I've had quite a few people request that I brew it. And basically, it's sort of like an amber cream ale. And I love cream ales, and I love amber ales, so it sounds like I'm gonna love this. That was a mess, but honestly, I miss that. A brew in the bag system is a great way to get into all grain brewing. It's really not much more difficult than extract brewing, and if you have the kettle, for an extra 30 or 40 bucks to get the brew in a bag, you can make the jump to all grain brewing really quickly. It's simple, it's easy, and it's time to get this bag out and get boiling. One of the great things about propane is speed. It's going to be up to a boil pretty quick with this thing. Hop additions, not difficult. Cluster at 60 minutes and 5 minutes. That's it. So this piece of equipment may not be completely necessary if you're first starting out brewing, but in my opinion, it will make your brew day so much more enjoyable because it's going to speed up the chill down process. Why is chilling your wort down so important? Because you need to take care of your yeast. Yeast health is super important. After all, this is what's responsible for turning our wort into beer. Another thing you can do to take care of your yeast is add yeast nutrients. So is 15 minutes left in the boil, I'm adding yeast nutrient and a Whirlfloc tablet. For today's batch, I'm going to be using cable car from Imperial Yeast and fermenting it at 60 degrees Fahrenheit, which brings me to fermentation temperature control. This really goes along with the last point because taking care of your yeast is the single best thing you can do to make your beer better. And one of the best ways to take care of your yeast is to make sure that you have control over the temperature during fermentation. My brew day is over, but there are still a few things you can do to take your beer to the next level. Now, if you're bottle conditioning, I highly recommend getting like these little these fizz, Northern Brewer calls them fizz drops. They might call them carbonation caps. It's basically just a sugar pill, and you just drop it in the bottle, put your beer in there, and then set them out at room temperature for 2 weeks, and that sugar is going to re-ferment. It's like a secondary fermentation inside the bottle, and it's going to create carbonation. Now that secondary fermentation in the bottle is going to absorb some of the oxygen. This beer style, I don't think is going to be particularly susceptible to oxygen exposure, so I wasn't too concerned with it. But the other way to carbonate your beer is to rack from your fermenter into a secondary vessel and then kind of mix in basically your sugar at that point, your corn sugar. I don't like doing it that way. I just feel like there's just a higher risk of oxygen exposure, contamination from the secondary bucket, and then you've got to stir it in, which to me seems like you're mixing a bunch of oxygen in there. Now, once again, this secondary fermentation is going to use up some of the oxygen in the bottle, but my preferred method is to use the carb drop or the fizz drop, rack the beer on top, cap it, set it out for a couple of weeks. And the last thing I think every brewer needs to focus on to make better beer, and it's the absolute hardest one for me, is patience. I have learned over the many batches of beer that I have brewed that it's usually the last few bottles or the last few pints you pull from a keg that are the absolute best tasting beers. Most beer will get better with a little bit of time. So for now, I'm gonna put these few bottles to sleep for a couple weeks and we'll see how they turn out. Oh, and if you'd like to find out how this Kentucky Common actually tastes, go follow me on Instagram at elementarybrewingco.visalia. I'm gonna let you know how it ended up tasting there. In the meantime, you can go check out this video right here, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.